Okay, to kind of wrap up the limbic system, I want to go into a few PowerPoint handouts that we have for this video and just talk about some specific parts of the limbic system, and then we'll move on to the meninges, which is going to be our next handout. So if we look at the limbic system, remember it's dealing with emotions and memory formation, but there's a specific part of the limbic system called the basal ganglia. It says the basal ganglia are paired masses of gray matter in each cerebral hemisphere. So they're kind of this hazy area right here. And it says that they are involved in the input and output of information through our cerebral cortex, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So they are information pathways. It says the basal ganglia are going to be controlling large autonomic movements of our skeletal system. So remember that pre-central gyrus is going to be sending information on how to move your skeletal muscles. It has to go through the basal ganglia on its way to the spinal cord. So we have some control over these large autonomic skeletal movements using the basal ganglia. Let me give you an example of this. So part of this basal ganglia is an area known as the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Now, it says they're responsible for controlling muscular movements. This is part of the basal ganglia. Now, to give you an idea about this, if we were to damage this basal ganglia, it would result in something called a tremor. That's when a person is shaking. So if I go and give you an example, if I hold my hand out here, my hand is pretty stable. That's because my basal ganglia is controlling these large skeletal movements. If this area begins to get damaged, then we can no longer control those large skeletal movements and we start to shake. All right, that shaking is called a tremor, and we can control that with our basal ganglia. So when I hold out my hand, I'm actually still moving some, right? You can't not move at all, but I can control my skeletal muscles using this basal ganglia. If I lose that ability, I end up with a tremor. Now, an example of this is Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease affects neurons in this part of the basal ganglia called the putamen. And the putamen, it's this gray area. You can see it on this CT scan. You can see this darker area on either side that's called the putamen. If that area degenerates, that is Parkinson's disease, and one of the symptoms of Parkinson's is a tremor. Now, you don't need Parkinson's to get a tremor. One of my graduate professors at Colorado State, he was climbing on his roof, and he fell off the roof, and he hit his head, and he actually damaged this basal ganglia part of his brain. And so he ended up with a tremor. He would shake, but he didn't have Parkinson's. So it was really interesting to see this professor work, because just like a symptom of Parkinson's, he had a tremor. So he would shake. And he was a lepidopterist. He was a butterfly scientist. And if he really concentrated and kind of braced his hand, he could get that shaking down. But, with what we do as butterfly scientists, we're working with very fragile specimens. And so when, I pull this specimen out and I'm holding it, he would just shake. And so, you're trying to put him in these boxes. You're trying to control, and be very careful so you don't break them. These specimens get really brittle and they break really easily. So he had trouble with this. I was back at CSU in 2002 to 2005, and I met him a couple summers ago because I was doing some extra work for CSU, doing some field work, and I met him in Fruta at a hotel where they were staying, and he said, "Look," and he holds out his hand, and doesn't have the tremor, and I was all amazed because he had such a hard time with it when I was in school with him, and he was laughing. He said that he had a surgery where they went in and they placed a device that helps him control that basal ganglia so he's not shaking anymore. So it's amazing, in the 10 years or so that between when I was in school and when I was working with him again, the surgical advancements, the medical advancements to help with this tremor. Now, you could look this up. I don't know if that is helping people with Parkinson's or not, but it did help my professor some. So pretty cool to think that that we can help with that. Now, another thing that the basal ganglia does, it says it also helps initiate and terminate cognitive processes. Some of these disorders that people like back in the 1950s thought were part of the frontal lobe with your personality are actually limbic system and basal nuclei disorders. So things like obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety, these are all thought to be a dysfunction of the circuits between our basal ganglia and the limbic system, not the frontal lobe with the personality. So, 50 years ago, doctors thought that schizophrenia was part of a personality disorder. Well, now we know that it's not. It's actually part of this connection between the limbic system and the cerebrum. And that is the issue with the different disorders. So it's not necessarily the personality disorders. Now, there are some personality disorders that affect the frontal lobe, but things like schizophrenia and obsessive compulsive behavior is not one of them. All right, so we are going to stop this video here. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about brain protection. It matches our spinal cord, so we're going to go back to a handout from chapter 13, 13a, and look at the meninges.